Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Florence and Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, and what is going to be the conclusion of this run of episodes treating the early Renaissance. We began back in July and have followed through with the history from the middle of the 1300s. And we've even arrived into that exciting transitional period between the early and high Renaissances. We're talking 1410s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 1460s. The high Renaissance is more of a early development in the 1470s and 80s and really climaxes in the 1500s. That makes 9 episodes of this run, but if we were to combine all of the early Renaissance topics treated throughout the entire run of the podcast, think back to Venice, think back to various topics we covered like Brunelleschi, there's actually 15 other episodes, and that makes 24 whopping episodes of early Renaissance material, so I don't know, 12, 13 hours. So good job if you made it through all of that. Before we get started on our topic today, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I've received some messages from you guys from this new Send Us a Text feature from the podcast hosting platform, and I want to kindly remind you that I cannot respond to these, as in the software doesn't allow it. So I'm getting questions from you guys that I can't answer. So please send me a direct message on Instagram, Facebook, or email me directly. I get stuff from you guys all the time. Do not use the Send a Text feature. Message me directly, and then I can answer your questions, okay? I also want to say briefly that I am always painfully aware of what we do not cover. So as I close a chapter, I am aware of what is not included. That every podcast topic is a deliberate and thought-out choice that I make in order to bring you all the most engaging, interesting, and professional content. It is impossible to cover everyone and everything, and many of us, I've learned, have strong opinions about who and what should be necessarily included in these conversations. I know you are here because you trust me to make that decision thoughtfully. These decisions are also based on my ability to do this with a certain level of expertise. I am not an expert on, let's say, the northern Italian courts. That's not to say I don't know a lot about them. I'm just not an expert. And that is indeed something I'm currently working on so that the future of this show might be able to adequately discuss the courts of Ferrara, Urbino, Milan, Mantua. I want to do that. And I'm also pondering a short series on the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent, which is something I have a lot of experience in. So looking even deeper at Florence, there's just an unlimited number of things here, and I can't do it all. But today, we're talking about one of the most significant pontificates of the early Renaissance, the one that really saw major transitions in the policy and layout of Rome. The seeds that would allow it to grow and eventually take over from Florence as an absolute center of humanistic cultural production. The Renaissance moves to Rome, so to speak. That is the expression I see all the time, right? And as the title suggests, we're discussing the thrilling papacy of Pope Nicholas V, someone very much tethered to the humanistic developments that were happening in Florence. Before we talk about Nicholas V, though, let's go over some of the basics of the structure of the papacy during the Renaissance period. The Roman papacy maintains that St. Peter himself was the first pope, the spiritual leader handed the metaphorical keys to heaven by Christ himself, and that divine ordinance elects his successor, the pope, all who are considered to be in the spiritual line of St. Peter. So when you see St. Peter in Renaissance art, he's usually holding keys. And that is also a symbol for the papacy itself. The papal coat of arms is the crown of the Pope with the keys of St. Peter. Do we understand that connection? So this was a very turbulent post, no more or less volatile than other monarchs. So for the Pope was indeed a monarch with immense power, not exactly like Pope Francis today, right? So why? First of all, the Papal States were a relatively large span of territory in Italy, making the Pope not only their sovereign, secular ruler of that specific territory, one in which he would have princes of certain territories. It's very complicated. But he was also a religious leader as well of the whole of the Latin West, not just the papal territories. That is, the Catholic world that was not only contained within that space, but sometimes, depending on the moment, the Holy Roman Empire, all of sort of France and Spain and these Catholic territories. The Pope was viewed as an absolute authority of religious matters, but not always respected as a political sovereign, and not always respected as an absolute power of religious material. So, if this is sounding confusing, it appears that the people of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were confused as well. The papal territories were often disputed, just as the Pope's authority was, all the way down to agreeing on who the Pope even was, right? Then there is the hot and cold relationship between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, and who was given authority. This led to the rising of political factions. Famously, in Florence, were the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, not just in Florence, but famous because this history is usually told through Dante, who was part of the victorious Guelph party in Florence. Those are those who supported the Pope, not the Emperor, who ultimately won and expelled the imperial sympathizers, the Ghibellines. Then came Pope Boniface VIII, whose policies divided the Guelphs, right? Guelph party supports the Pope. Boniface VIII comes along with all of these crazy policies. The Guelph party divides into black and white Guelphs, those who support the Pope and those who do not. Dante indeed opposed Pope Boniface VIII, and Dante was a white Guelph, and that is how he was exiled when the black Guelphs took over in Florence. In exile, he wrote his Divine Comedy. Appropriately, we find Pope Boniface in the 8th circle of hell. Pope Nicholas III, not Pope Nicholas V, who we're talking about today, Pope Nicholas III is in the 8th circle of hell, upside down, shoved into a baptismal font where his feet are set on fire. Don't worry, reader. He assures you that Pope Boniface VIII is going to join him soon. Dante puts Boniface in hell before his death even occurs. So this confusion over papal power was made even more evident in the very famous Papal Schism in 1378. I have to tell this briefly because it's very complicated. In essence, the seat of the papacy had resided in Avignon, that is, southern France, from 1309 to 1377. Another literary giant. Think back to Petrarch, the early humanist and poet who jump-started the Proto-Renaissance. He relocated to Avignon with his family and the papacy in 1309. Okay, so the papacy's in Avignon from 1309 to 1377. That is why he was there, and that is where he saw or met or invented his famous muse, Laura. And that is where he was inspired to write about her in his Canzoniere. So what happens to the papacy? In the most basic terms, it moved back to Rome in 1377 under Gregory XI, which would disturb, this is my theory, the vast mercantile center that Avignon was under the papal curia. So it's a matter of economics. Gregory died the next year, and the clergy in Avignon refused the papacy of Gregory's successor in Rome, Pope Urban VI, electing who is known as the first anti-pope, Pope Clement VII. Now we have a schism. We have two popes, one in Avignon, one in Rome. So Pope Urban VI is a few popes before our Nicholas V, but he was fighting for supremacy against the Avignon anti-pope and all of these other weird claims that were popping up to the papacy that were disturbing sort of the central power of the Pope, because there was more than one all over the place. 4 Roman popes followed Urban VI. Note, I'm saying Roman popes because they were everywhere. Before we get to Eugenius IV. We've talked about Eugenius IV, if we recall, that pope who moved the Curia to Florence for about 10 years, overseeing Cosimo's patronage of the convent of San Marco, overseeing the Council of Florence, that failed union between the Latin West and the Byzantine Empire. Indeed, it's likely that part of the reason the Ottoman Empire was able to grow and end the Byzantine Empire was because the Christians could not stop fighting each other to unite against the Turks, trying to figure out who the Pope was. Keeping all of this history in mind as we move forward, who was Pope Nicholas V? Had he not been elected Pope, he would have left his mark on Renaissance history as one of those important humanists who diligently sought to revive the virtues of the classical world. He was born Tommaso Parentuccelli in 1397 in the Republic of Genoa. His education began in another intellectual center, Bologna, where he temporarily had to step away in the 1420s to earn some money as a tutor. Where did he go? The thriving humanist circles of Florence, all of which were based around the finding, the translating, copying, and reading of ancient Greek and Latin texts. Although he worked predominantly for the Strozzi and the Albizzi families, those are the rival families of the Medici, this does not seem to have affected his relationship with the wider humanist culture of Florence or his relationship with the Medici family. He would eventually return to Bologna to finish his studies in theology, eventually being declared Bishop of Bologna in 1444 by Pope Eugenius IV, who would have only just returned to Rome with the Papal Curia the year before, after a 10-year absence. So Tommaso Parentuccelli not only served on the Council of Florence, working to unite the churches underneath the Pope, but he also served as a powerful diplomat for Eugenius IV, often journeying into Northern Europe. Like Petrarch before him, among many other contemporaries who did this, he made it his mission to return to Italy with whatever manuscripts he could acquire to advance and expand the humanist cultural movement, but also grow his own personal library. Throughout his many journeys to Florence, he made friends with someone by the name of Vespasiano da Bisticci, who was a very prominent Florentine bookseller who became among the most important and well-known in all of Italy, and he was a favorite of Cosimo de' Medici, one who ran a shop that served also as a public meeting place for scholars and humanists. So returning frequently to Florence throughout the 1440s, Tommaso was able to make a name for himself as not only a respected intellectual, but an elite scholar and an authority of ancient and religious texts. When Cosimo's library at St. Marco was built, he entrusted the bookseller Vespasiano to complete the library with any missing texts that were needed. Think back, he had Niccolò Niccoli's collection, some of his own collection that he wanted to make San Marco a complete public library, but there were holes in the collection. Cosimo wanted to ensure that no area of knowledge was left unrepresented. So Vespasiano resorted to his friend, Tommaso Parentuccelli, who happily helped him inventory and compile the list of texts needed for the Library of San Marco to satisfy the patron, Cosimo. Then, on a cold day in the early months of 1447, Pope Eugenius IV died in Rome. A papal conclave ensued, that is, a gathering of cardinals, all who cast their votes for the next pope. Our famed intellectual, the Bishop of Bologna, the Medici ally, the friend of the Florentine humanists and book collectors and scholars, Tommaso Parentuccelli was elected pope by the Papal Conclave on the 6th of March of 1447, taking the name Nicholas V in honor of his mentor. His papacy lasted 8 full years until March of 1455, which is neither long nor short for a papacy, serving as the essential turning point in the transportation of Renaissance humanism to Rome. None other than the famed humanist Leon Battista Alberti, the author of the Treatise on Painting, which codified the technical application of one-point perspective. Alberti served on his papal curia. They actually had met and become acquainted at the University of Bologna when Nicholas V was still Tommaso Parontucelli. The Rome that Nicholas inherited is not the Rome that we know or imagine. It would not have been a thriving center of art, of architecture, of grand boulevards, of well-maintained ruins. No, it was at the beginning of being valued for the wealth of ancient art and resources it held. It was usually Florentines like Donatello and Brunelleschi who were going into that swamp of a city on the banks of the Tiber, digging around for ancient sources so that they could make new modern art. That contradiction, right? But Nicholas had a vision for Rome. He had a desire to restore it under his careful curation, a scheme that would rely on first establishing peace and allowing massive building projects. At the very start of his reign, the last remnants of opposition ended under Nicholas with the resignation of the last antipope. So Nicholas was the first unchallenged Roman Pope in nearly 100 years. So Nicholas, from his previous work on the San Marco Library and developed friendship with Cosimo de' Medici, also decided that Cosimo would be his banker, maintaining that strong link between the papacy and the Medici, and keeping a link between the wealthiest enterprises in Italy, the Medici Bank and the papacy. Okay, for the first time since 1378, let me repeat, the Pope could comfortably situate himself as entirely unchallenged by an anti-pope, and he had a banker who directly aligned with his own vision as Pope and patron, humanism, right? Now, he has time, because he's not deflecting claims to his position, and he has resources. Still at this time in Rome, what is known as Old St. Peter's was standing. That is the early Christian basilica that was not rebuilt until the High Renaissance and Baroque eras to see what we know today as St. Peter's. The plan to completely rebuild it was Nicholas's idea, and the subsequent popes who indeed did only did so because Nicholas laid the groundwork for it. During his papacy, though, he was able to restore Old St. Peter's with the help of Alberti, and he began to deconstruct the old Vatican Palace and make room for what we see today, known as the Apostolic Palace, although he certainly didn't live in the version that we see today. Nicholas also added defensive walls around the entirety of the Vatican Palace and St. Peter's. He commissioned Leon Battista Alberti to help design and carry out a large part of this building program, including the rebuilding not only of the Vatican. We're not just talking about a pope who was rebuilding the Vatican, but the Borgo, which is the area across the Tiber River from the Castel Sant'Angelo. That's the papal fortress that was built on top of the mausoleum of Emperor Hadrian, my favorite of the Roman emperors. Alberti was also tasked to design an entire new wing for the Vatican Palace. They also worked to restore the ancient aqueducts, bringing more fresh water to the city, to the people of Rome, one of which was supplied by Alberti with a basin design, which is actually now where the Trevi Fountain is in Rome today. Although, of course, that fountain that we see now in the sculpture has nothing to do with Nicholas and Alberti, only that they were responsible for bringing the water back from the aqueduct to that part of Rome. So, in the end, Nicholas has dumped an obscene amount of money, not only into the Vatican in his sort of somewhat personal patronage, but into much of Rome itself, hoping to reestablish the dignity of the city. One major drawback to this is that he also is the one responsible for stripping the Colosseum of much of its marble for these restoration projects. Among the most important initiatives started by Nicholas was setting in motion the plan to create the Apostolic Library. That is the famed, the mysterious Vatican Library that until then consisted of a semi-private collection of manuscripts that were predominantly of religious material. Most of the collection, the Vatican collection, was destroyed by a fire and by the looting of the Lateran Palace in the 14th century. Then the papacy was in Avignon, and the popes began to collect again to build a library there, private, but all of their texts didn't actually make it back to Rome. Eugenius apparently only left behind a few hundred manuscripts in Rome by the time that Nicholas V became pope. His mission should sound familiar because it is directly in line with what was happening in Florence under Cosimo de' Medici. Pope Nicholas wanted to first restore Rome physically so that he could make it a center of scholarly learning via the public availability of humanist text, and he was particularly interested in Greek classics. That means he was going to need to hire Greek and Latin scholars to make translations and copies of these texts, bringing to Rome the intellectuals of his day. This included trying to get translations of Homer's Iliad, which is very difficult for people in this period. Like San Marco in Florence, he also wanted to create a public library. That is the point. Not simply a large private collection, and he wanted the library to be in a modern building, a new public library of the Vatican Palace. With roughly 350 codices and manuscripts inherited from the existing collection, plus adding his own collection, remember he was a collector, then the new translations, the copies, and the purchasing of new books, the Vatican Library under Nicholas was well underway. Let's not forget that before he was pope, he was the one consulted to complete San Marco's library in Florence. Whatever he saw and experienced in the academic culture in Florence, he wanted to emulate in Rome with all the power and all the money of the papacy. It should be no surprise who he hired to decorate his private chapel in the Vatican Palace. None other than the same artist who decorated San Marco, Fra Angelico. Known as the Niccoline Chapel, these frescoes were completed from 1447 to 1449, and they show scenes from the lives of St. Lawrence and St. Stephen. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the fresco details, but you should browse them when you have time. Take a look. You'll notice that there is indeed a focus on grandiose architecture, both interior and exterior spaces, palatial and urban, a reflection of Nicholas V's ongoing rebuilding of Rome and his desire to reposition the papal city as the most prominent in all of Christendom.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show. St. Lawrence is, of course, my namesake. I'm not a Catholic, but I also have enjoyed seeing him being represented, especially since he's martyred by being grilled alive, and I happen to be quite reliable manning the grill for family cookouts. Is this a coincidence? You tell me. But this theme that we see in Fra Angelico's works, I've seen it termed as Christian humanism. This is very spiritual approach to the painting trends in Florence that is so trademark Fra Angelico. It is so strong in San Lorenzo's martyrdom in the Niccoline Chapel. We see two scenes in one composition. On one side, Lawrence stands in front of Emperor Valerian, and he seems to be not looking at the emperor. He's looking to the other scene in the composition, where he himself is being stripped and grilled alive. It's chilling, a little interesting. It's like the beginning of a Final Destination movie where someone sees all of their deaths. And Nicholas V had a reason to revere St. Lawrence. Now, we have to recall St. Lawrence, San Lorenzo, is also one of the patron saints of the Medici. Now, we can see the Catholic sense of humor in that St. Lawrence is also the patron saint of cooks and bakers, right? But also that he's the patron saint of those who fire can cause great harm to. That means librarians and lovers of books. So, in the fresco where St. Lawrence is being ordained by Pope Sixtus II, according to his history, not only is the image of Sixtus II actually the face of Nicholas V, which means it's a contemporary portrait of Nicholas ordaining St. Lawrence, it's a pope as a pope, but a devotee behind them, directly in the middle of the composition, is seen opening up a beautiful codex, which is linking Nicholas V and his papal agenda to collect books and render the making of public knowledge linked to the history of the church and the history of the papacy. Sixtus is Nicholas V ordaining St. Lawrence, the patron saint of book lovers. Someone's holding open a book. Nicholas is collecting books and building a library. Is all of this making sense? Painted by Fra Angelico, who painted that very public, famous library in San Marco in Florence, which the Pope, previously, before he was Pope, had helped give the inventory for. As such, the heretical nature of humanism, which the Church criticized historically, could begin to fall in line with the Vatican's theology, of which Nicholas was a schooled master. But a critical event both stained his reign and helped to progress his humanistic agenda. I'm talking about the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Let's review. The Council of Florence happened between the Byzantine Empire and the Latin West. They were not able to muster and unite against the Ottoman Turks, who were led by Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, and so in 1453 he conquered Istanbul, ending the Byzantine Empire and making it the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople was seen as a failure for the Pope, Nicholas V, who allowed a Christian empire, even though they had their differences, to fall to a Muslim one. This is the general sense of it, but just like in Florence, where Cosimo immediately offered hospitality and work to the Byzantine Greek scholars exiled from Constantinople, Rome offered hospitality to them as well under Nicholas V. Why? He needed his Greek text translated. but he also wanted the books that they were going to bring with them. The fall of Constantinople was among the most important forces for the wider dissemination of teachings of Greek classics in Renaissance Italy. And it's not that Nicholas did nothing to prevent the Ottoman conquest. In 1452, 1 year before the fall, he issued a papal bull known as Dum Diversas, which permitted Portugal to enslave those who fought against the Catholic faith. That means Saracens. This is where it gets a little ugly. Not only could this build military support against the Ottomans, because it offered financial incentive. You could go acquire slaves. Militants could then capture slaves for their enterprise, sell them on the markets all along the Mediterranean. Now, while this type of slavery was not new in this part of the world, the papal bull gave official authority to subjugate people by force in North Africa and beyond. While this is not the Atlantic slave trade, this is sort of a precursor to it. Because what is the criteria? You're not Christian. Now, that existed before Nicholas, but he issued a bull to reinforce it for the King of Portugal. So, Nicholas, too, he wanted to reclaim Constantinople, but he could not unite the Latin West for a powerful counter-offensive. Ultimately, Constantinople, now Istanbul, would remain in Turkish hands. We can rightly criticize the effects of his policies on slavery and the likelihood of the effects of their aftermath. We can see him as militarily ineffective as well, but that falls in line with who he was, which was predominantly a humanist scholar. Pope Nicholas died in 1455. The Vatican Library had grown from 350 to 1,200 volumes under his reign, hundreds of which were in Greek. His humanistic fiber was now threaded into Roman culture, and there was no going back. Today, the library has over 1 million books and 75,000 historic codices. Nicholas V was the policy driver behind setting the Roman Renaissance in motion, including the rebuilding of Rome and the expansion of Roman culture to align with the virtues that he saw in Florentine cultural trends, where ironically were based on those of ancient Rome. Did Rome rediscover itself outside of itself? I don't know. Not all of his predecessors would value the mass spending on books that he did, but by the arrival of Pope Sixtus IV in 1471, the Vatican archives would be founded, the Sistine Chapel would be built, and so many of those famed Florentine artists would be invited to Rome. From then on, the trend would continue all the way into the age of Raphael and his Vatican stanze, the age of Michelangelo with the Sistine ceiling and the Last Judgment, and that wonderful period known as the High Renaissance, the stones of which were laid by Pope Nicholas V. My dear listeners, I had such a thrilling experience working through this period with all of you. There is always more work to be done, and we look ahead to the many ways in which this project can take shape. Please remember to leave the show a rating and review. Please remember to join us on all of our social media channels. Check out our YouTube channel. Until next time, Renaissance people, arrivederci.